This video is for reading 29, which is entitled, I Don't Like Passing as a Straight Woman, Queer Negotiations of Identity and Social Group Membership by author Carla Pfeiffer. So this piece is focused on how a particular group of queer women make sense of their gender slash sexual identities given their partnership with transgender men. So this reading is a piece that brings in our understandings of both gender and sexuality. And just a reminder, these are very distinct concepts. So I'm going to turn to some additional sociological background. So the concept of sexuality is a multidimensional concept that incorporates psychological, biological, and sociological components, such as sexual desire, sexual response, and product and gender roles. It is a product of our sexual identity, our sexual orientation, and sexual scripts, among other things. We have a tendency to use the word sexuality and sexual orientation as if they were synonymous and interchangeable, and although they may function that way in larger kind of public spaces, or in terms of like common parlance, academically, it's worth noting they are distinct concepts. Sexual orientation, sexuality is a factor, or is a product of multiple factors, of which sexual orientation is one. So what is sexual orientation? It is a component of our sexual identity that classifies sexual partner attraction. And although we use a threefold categorization, as was previously discussed in other videos, it is really more like a continuum. But the threefold classification or categorization that we commonly use is homosexual, heterosexual, and bisexual. It's worth noting that our gender, and our sex identity is not the same thing as sexual orientation, nor are they perfectly aligned. But oftentimes people will use them as if they're interchangeable, as if someone's gender identity is directly pertinent to their sexual orientation, which raises the question, why do so many people who are not in a sociology class, why do they think that your gender identity tells you something about your sexual orientation, or your sexual orientation tells you something about your gender identity? And in order to understand that, we need to discuss two concepts: compulsory heterosexuality and heteronormative. So, to be masculine and feminine, particularly in Anglo European societies or societies that were colonized by Anglo Europeans, it's not just to be male bodied and female bodied, but it's also to be presumably heterosexual. So, in this way, all three concepts become linked. We take the link between gender and sex for granted, that if you are a female bodied person, you're going to identify as a woman. If you are a male bodied person that was assigned male at birth, you're going to identify as a man. But we also take the link between gender and heterosexuality for granted. Um, and this reflects in these societies a concept called compulsory heterosexuality, which focuses on the idea that heterosexuality is the default or obligatory sexuality. It's the status that society provides, and assumes, and it's the status that in society comes with institutional privileges. And that's because the structure of society is heteronormative. To be heterosexual is to be considered as being normative, and to not be heterosexual is to be considered deviant and to face the potential stigmas and oppressions that go along with that. So, to return now to our reading, the author expresses two primary questions on page 305. And those questions are: what is at stake when we foreclose opportunities for considering the myriad ways in which sex, gender, and sexual identities are formed, and are formed in and through processes of social interaction? And the second question: in what ways might a focus on passing curtail opportunities to critically examine the efforts of those with normative social privilege to maintain and naturalize such privilege. And so she is going to be using her research as a way of applying those questions to her sample and answering them. So before we get into her findings, let's consider her methodology. She collected her data through in-depth interviews with 50 cis women, meaning their gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth, but they are the romantic partners of trans men, meaning these are individuals whose gender identity of man does not align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. These men are at various stages of their sex slash gender transition, but at least according to their partners, most are perceived always or almost always as male in social context. In terms of how the author, how she obtained this sample, she recruited them using the internet, and social networking. And we call this type of sampling methodology snowball sampling. So, ultimately, it's not necessarily going to be representative or necessarily generalizable, but at least in terms of like geographic diversity, and age diversity, the sample is pretty diverse. She does note that it's not very racially diverse. So now let's turn to the findings. What did the interviews reveal about the experience of the cis women partners of trans men? So first of all, particularly if they were with their partner before their partner, began their transition, it definitely raised some questions about their own sexual identity and how their own sexual identity should be understood by both themselves as well as communicated to other people. And that probably explains why so many of them have adopted the queer identity label, because a lot of our other labels, bisexual, homosexual, heterosexual, are really kind of based upon this binary kind of view, this cisgender binary view of gender. So it could be, very confusing to try to use those sexuality labels when you're now dating someone who is transitioned and isn't clearly positioned within the binary themselves. Another kind of common theme is, the struggle that they have with having their identity as queer, being recognized in social context. A lot of these women talk about how they're misrecognized and mislabeled. And if you think about why that is, you just need to consider, if you were just a outsider, looking in on them in their relationship, then what you would see likely is a man, and a woman. So you would read them as being, just your typical cisgender heterosexual couple, because, as they note, a lot of their partners successfully, are perceived as men. They're not recognized as transgender men, which means that these women's identity as queer isn't going to be clearly recognized. And so, a big part of of the author's reporting her findings is emphasizing how, they push back against being viewed as, being in a heteronormative relationship, even if sometimes they do make decisions to engage in that normativity, consciously with their partners. There is still just resistance to just kind of being labeled as being part of the heteronormative structure. And so, this relates to another theme that comes up in the reading, in the findings, which is the pressure of having to do additional work to define and redefine their identities. And the author emphasizes that the role of the internet and the increased visibility of trans individuals and their experiences definitely provides these women with a resource that they wouldn't necessarily have had like 10, 15 years ago. Now, of course, we are developing languages and communities, and as well as just kind of awareness, right? That these types of relationships exist, which, may not necessarily lead to them not being misrecognized, but at least, especially if, they communicate their relationship and their identity, their chosen identity to others. The likelihood is that what they communicate doesn't necessarily come as some huge shock or something that the person has never heard of before. Because obviously, in a society where we know trans individuals exist, that means that people are dating and have intimate relationships with trans individuals. So, this is not, this is it is definitely not fully socially acceptable, especially in some places more than others. But it's not the same level of marginalization and stigmatization as it perhaps once was 20, 30 years ago. Um, and so one thing that these narratives, really emphasize is that queer visibility remains linked to these perceptions of a person displaying female masculinity or male femininity. And so if you consider yourself to be queer, but your gender expression does not align with those perceptions, it is likely that you're going to be misrecognized and mislabeled. And then particularly if you are with a partner who is read as being just, a stereotypical cisgender man. And this seemed to cause for a lot of respondents a good amount of angst. A lot of them expressed to the author that they had concerns about experiencing queer invisibility. And and please do actually read the reading so you can kind of hear in their own words why they feel this way, and how being even excluded from gay and lesbian social spaces really caused them a good amount of pain, because of the rejection of their proclaimed social identity, and them not having full control over people being accepting of them in queer spaces. And so that quote from page 310, these narratives attest to the instability of membership and recognition within various identity based communities, really just raises the question about a question that's come up in multiple of our readings about identity. How much of your identity isn't just about what you yourself claim and how you yourself see yourself, but how much of your identity is also based upon you being recognized as being a member of a group and being accepted within that group by others. And that reliance on other people's recognition and acceptance, of course, can be very anxiety inducing because you don't have full control over that. And so the author concludes the reading by highlighting the importance of that concept of recognition, not just in terms of how we do gender, but also related to how we perceive and recognize sexuality. And so the question that I encourage you to consider based on the reading is this. If you don't identify as queer or are not in a relationship with a trans individual, this reading maybe was a little bit harder to understand. But at its core, this article raises questions about the importance of self defining one's identity and the role that others play in that. How would you feel if you were consistently misrecognized? Do you think it is important for one's self identity to be a recognized member of the social group that you claim?